Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome here in the Blauwzaal. Welcome to the weekly lunch lecture by Studium Generale. Today's program will be 1 hour. And for the bachelor students among you, you have the opportunity to register for Use iTech at the end of the lecture when you leave the room. So just so you know. In the next hour, we're going to be discussing a phenomenon that often happens behind closed doors. And therefore, we generally know and hear little about it. It's called coercive control, or in Dutch, we use the term intieme terreur. And I was just curious to see with you here today, who of you was already familiar with one of those terms before you read about the lecture? Could you raise your hand? So I would say that's only like maybe less than 10% of you. And maybe some of you might be more familiar with the statistic that in the Netherlands, every 8 days a woman is murdered. And it turns out that in many of those cases, the murder was committed by their partner or their ex-partner. Now, experts recognize a pattern of steps that can turn a seemingly romantic relationship into an abusive one with, sadly, sometimes deadly consequences. Those patterns can be things like control, coercion, and intimidation. They are described as red flags. Maybe you've heard of the term red flags before, but somehow they are not easily recognized. Not by the victims themselves and not by their friends, their family, the people around them. Why is this the case and what could we do to change that? Well, today's lecture hopefully might be a start. And I'm glad we have someone with us today who has years of experience with legal cases involving domestic violence like coercive control. Ariane Hendriks, she worked as a family law attorney for 17 years. But she became frustrated with the way that the judicial system in the Netherlands deals with domestic violence cases. So she decided to switch to university. She now teaches at Tilburg University. She teaches law students on how to recognize what we often overlook, intimate partner abuse. And together with a colleague last year, she also wrote a book about this, which is called Met liefde heeft het niets te maken. It has nothing to do with love. So I'm glad she's with us here today to tell us more about coercive control, how to recognize it. So please join me in welcoming Ariane Hendriks.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about... It works. I'm going to talk about intimate partner violence, and that includes talking about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, which can also lead to femicide. So I thought it wise to include a quick trigger warning if there are people in the audience who are really uncomfortable with the topic. This is what we're going to discuss in the next hour, so it's good to be aware of that. Coercive control, it's very important to realize, is not an incident, it's a pattern. It's a pattern of behavior that is aimed at controlling and dominating another person. And in the setting that we're going to talk about today, it's used to dominate and control an intimate partner. So it's a form of intimate partner abuse, and it's aimed at gaining and keeping control. And this is why it's a very serious form of intimate partner violence, because it really gets to the core of a person. It's a form of often emotional, psychological abuse that over time really erodes the other person's identity, autonomy, and freedom. And as it was noticed in the introduction, it can be very hard to identify because a lot of this behavior is very subtle. It evolves over time. So we should always look at the whole picture, look at the film, not the photo, as we say, in order to grasp what's really going on. Some facts about coercive control. First of all, it's gender specific in the sense that perpetrators are mostly men and victims are mostly women. It can also be the other way around. It's very important to realize that. It's not a black and white picture, but it's predominantly the case that men perpetrate this form of intimate partner violence with women as victims. And this is not the case with other forms of domestic violence. For instance, situational physical violence, more like the escalation of arguments into physical aggression, is also a form of violence that's perpetrated by women with men as their victims. But this specific type of intimate partner violence is mostly aimed at women. It affects thousands of people yearly. Estimates are up to 200,000. But it's hard to get a grasp on this number because a lot of the behavior that forms a part of this pattern is in itself not a criminal offense. Of course, physical abuse, that's clear, it's prohibited by law. But slowly eroding the self-confidence of your partner is not a criminal offense in itself. So the usual statistics that we have of police reports and convictions, for instance, don't apply on coercive control. So it's mostly self-reported, these numbers, and we are not really sure how many people this really affects. Personally, in my experience, from what I've seen in the family law context, I am sure it affects thousands of women each year. Victims of coercive control can be found in any demographic. It really goes all the way across the society. So it pertains people of all ethnic backgrounds, of all cultural and religious backgrounds, and also of all levels of education. Personally, my impression is, but this is based on my own experiences, that coercive control is more prevalent among more highly educated people, because you have to be in a certain way clever to control and dominate another person in such often subtle ways. Coercive control can lead to femicide. Most ex-partner killings are preceded by coercive control. So it's red flags that can really lead to really dramatic outcomes. And as I said, as a pattern of behavior, it's not a crime in the Netherlands. This is not the case in all countries. For instance, in the United Kingdom, coercive control as a pattern of abuse has already been a criminal offense for the last 15 years. But in Holland, we are not that far. It is on the political agenda to consider that. And that's an outcome of the attention that we see now for femicide here. So what we're going to discuss, the pattern of coercive control in a relationship over time, how does it evolve? The key features of the pattern, the connection between coercive control and femicide, and the question, why is it so hard to identify? Why don't you see it sooner? The early stages of coercive control are very often characterized by what we call love bombing. A tense attention from the partner who you have just met, who you've just started to date, can be very overwhelming. Not just a red rose as a sign of romance, but a whole bunch of roses and more, and expensive gifts, and immediately suggesting to go on a holiday together. It's like trying to speed up the process of getting to know a person, the natural evolvement of a relationship. So everything has to happen at once. Meeting the parents, going away together, even moving in, mentioning marriage or children. It is often a rapid succession of stages that normally takes more time to evolve. And often we see there already the signs of jealousy and possessiveness that are framed as love. I cannot bear not to be with you. I cannot bear if you speak with somebody else because we are meant to be together forever. So there is a rapid emotional closeness. And often you see that partners who show this type of behavior are extremely interested in the women that they are trying to date and get into a relationship. So this caricature of men who don't listen, who never ask a question about your personal life, these men typically do. They want to get to know you as soon as possible. get intimate information from you, and create rapid emotional closeness. It's a shame this doesn't work. So you get statements like, I only ever want to be with you, you're the only one who understands me, we're meant to be together forever. And if you look at these statements as such, well, most of modern pop culture songs are built on sayings like that. So it's not so hard, not so easy to distinguish just typical declarations of love, being in love, with something that's more insidious. This is one of the reasons why it's really hard to identify this as a problematic occurrence at this stage. But you have functions of love bombing that are really aimed at getting a person in a relationship as soon as possible. The idea is to get a woman in a relationship as soon as possible and then get her there. And the idea of functioning of love bombing is also that you get information out of a partner that you can later use to manipulate her in the relationship. For instance, very often do you see that in the beginning romantic stages, a perpetrator will ask a lot of very personal questions about how is your relationship with your family, how is your relationship with your parents. And if you then tell, like, well, I don't always feel understood by my parents, we've had a rocky relationship in the past, I sometimes feel that they don't really care about me. Later on in the relationship, a perpetrator will use that information to try to manipulate you in breaking off contact with your parents. You know, you told me that you often feel misunderstood by your parents. Well, I've seen them around now a few times. I've met them a few times. And you know what? I think you're really right. I think your instincts are totally correct. I really think that these people don't care about you. And this is a way to manipulate a person into isolation. And this is a feature of coercive control that we're going to discuss. Another function of love bombing is that often this first period feels really great. It can be really intensely romantic. A victim may feel understood, really feel that they've met their soulmate. And this creates a memory of a time, a happy time, when everything was good in the relationship, that the victim will later try to get back to when the control gets worse. Because a victim will think, well, we started off great. We had a great first 6 months or a great first year. And now things are not really feeling right, but if I only adjust my behavior to what my partner wants, I'm sure we can get back to the time that everything was so wonderful. But when the relationship evolves, we see that a perpetrator will start turning on the screws. So we see increasing criticism, and not the normal type in a relationship, like, okay, you start living together and you realize that you have to deal with the personal habits of a partner on a daily basis. No, it's criticism on every level. How you dress, how you look, how you behave. And this slowly starts to erode self-confidence. But we also see increasing restrictions. Who can you meet? Who can you talk with? Can you go out and do your hobbies? Can you go out to do sports? We often see that this is a subtle pattern. It doesn't start with, oh, I now forbid you to go to your gym class. Of course not, because a woman will think, okay, who are you to forbid me anything? That's not going to happen. It's much more subtle. I feel so alone if you're away. Isn't it great to be together? I would really love to see you more. Can we look at each other's schedules and see how we can prioritize time together? So it's more subtle than that, but over time, it really restricts a person in the relationship. And we see increasing control, monitoring, always sharing locations, very frequent apping or messaging, just to keeping tabs on you all the time. This introduction of criticism and restrictions is very subtle often, also hard to identify. And the victim will adapt her behavior over time, not overnight, as goes for the perpetrator. So again, this is not something that you can just simply see in a few months' time. Often this takes much longer. But what we see as a cumulative impact of this is entrenched control. This can lead to reduced autonomy. Over time, victims lose all personal freedom in a relationship like this. I've had clients who were highly educated, who had really good jobs, who were managing 20 or 30 people at work, and who at home were not allowed to decide what they would do on their sandwich in the morning, because the perpetrator would decide for them what they should do, because they knew best, they knew better how to take care of their health, how to take care of their looks, and this, of course, doesn't happen overnight, but this takes time. But it leads to a breakdown of autonomy. And fear of consequences is something that is slowly introduced, because you may have noticed that I didn't mention physical abuse or physical aggression up to now as part of this pattern. Most of this abuse is psychological, emotional. But that doesn't mean that there is no fear. Fear is often something that creeps in the relationship as a person experiences more control, more monitoring, and becomes more afraid of what the perpetrator may do if she crosses the lines. So let's have a look at the tactics of coercive control. Like, what does a perpetrator do to get to this outcome, to get a person in the relationship and then keep her there? Isolation is a very important feature of coercive control. Again, a gradual process wherein the controlling partner will cut off the other person from friends, family, support networks. It usually starts with the work colleagues. They go out the window first, then the friends, then the family. And this is done by manipulation. Criticizing friends or family. They don't really care about you. Haven't you noticed that they only invite you if they have nothing better to do? You told me that sometimes you're insecure about your friendship with this person. Well, I've had a look at it and I think you're right. They're not really interested in you. That's the subtle way. But there's less subtle ways, like creating conflict before or after any social event. For instance, you go out for a drink with your friends and you come back late at night, and then your partner will interrogate you for hours. Who did you speak with? Who did you meet? Did you see anybody that you found attractive? Should I be worried about our relationship? Is there anybody that I should be jealous of? And then you would think, okay, I'll try to reassure you. Okay, apparently you're really insecure. I don't want you to feel that way, so I'll explain to you. No, nothing happened. We just had a night. I didn't speak with any guys. I was not interested in other people. But this will go on. And you have to go to work in the morning, and you actually really want to sleep. So if this pattern, if this occurs a lot of times after a social event, the next time you will think, okay, is it really worth my while to go? Maybe I'm not up for the hassle tonight. Maybe I'll just skip. But we also see monitoring and restricting communication. If you feel that your partner is controlling your communication, obviously you will start to self-isolate because you don't want to be explaining yourself all the time to your partner who is criticizing your every move. But the outcome of this is what we call reduced external perspective. You have no network around you anymore to tell you, hey, I'm not so sure that this guy is okay for you. I wonder what's going on in your relationship. By the time that the isolation gets really severe is when you actually need this external perspective most. But this is, of course, why this is a tactic of coercive control. If you limit the amount of people in your life who can give you feedback and say, I'm not so sure about what's going on with you. Can we talk about this? Do you need help? Of course, this leads to a more vulnerable position of the victim who will find it harder to leave. Monitoring and surveillance, I've mentioned already. We see a lot of tracking. This is often framed as care or concern. I just want to know that you're safe. Again, this makes this really difficult to distinguish from a normal, healthy relationship because unfortunately in a society, it is sometimes a good idea to share your location if you go home late at night on your own. But if it's not an offer, but an expectation or even a demand, then of course we're dealing with something else. And we see technology now makes it extremely hard to, easy to monitor and act as surveillance. When I started as an attorney, it was still hard work to stalk somebody. You would actually have to be physically present or do really complicated things with external cameras. And now you just put an AirTag in somebody's bag or you put an AirTag under somebody's bike seat. It makes life for a stalker very easy. And also checking phones, putting apps in a phone that can monitor. This is often very easily done. But sometimes old-fashioned, simply demanding constant updates. Where are you? Who are you with? Who are you talking to? And for instance, a shared bank account, which is very normal to have in a relationship, gives the perpetrator the possibility to see every penny you spend from the shared account. Who are you having coffee with? I see that you are in a bar you just paid. But also breaking into somebody's social media, just keeping tabs. And this loss of privacy, of course, leads to a situation that a victim will start to self-regulate in order to avoid all kinds of nasty situations. Micro-regulation of daily life. Small, repeated controls, but they accumulate and lead to an erosion of independence. For instance, dictating what a person can wear, what a person can eat, controlling schedules, routines, when do you sleep, when are you supposed to wake up. These are all things that a perpetrator will start to control. Often again in the frame of, I care about you, I want you to be healthy, you cannot take care of yourself, so I do it for you. We see a lot of gaslighting and psychological manipulation. This is often very effective. Gaslighting, of course, a little bit of a trendy word, but it's something that we see a lot in this pattern of abuse, and it really works. If you are in a relationship and a person flat out denies things that happen, and you are not, especially if you're already isolated, you don't have other people to help you believe in what you experienced and what you saw with your own eyes, it becomes really easy to become manipulated. I've had clients, for instance, where their partner, the perpetrator of the abuse, would hide their possessions in the house. And then they would have to go to work. Where are my car keys? I have an important meeting. And the victim would look all over, search the entire house. And then at the end, the keys turned out to be lying on the place where they were supposed to have been all the time. And then the perpetrator would say, look, they're there. They were there all the time. I really think you don't have a grip on things anymore. You're losing it. It's good that you have me so that I can take care of you. And these things may seem like, okay, really crazy, but this actually happens, and it's part of a pattern. I've seen it in a lot of cases, examples like this. So this is deliberate behavior. Or abusing somebody verbally, saying really bad words to somebody in an argument, and the next day flat out deny that you ever said it. Of course, the first time you will think, okay, I'm not crazy, I heard it, you said it to me. But if this happens again and again, and it's part of a whole other pattern of abuse and manipulation, people really start to experience self-doubt. And it's very easy over time to tell people, oh, you are actually crazy, you're always being hysterical, you are being paranoid. And this confusion can lead a victim to stay in a relationship much longer than she would otherwise have done. Dependency creation, that's often very practical. Limit access to money or resources, not being allowed to have control of your own salary, not being allowed to have a bank card, but also discourage education or career progress. We see that a lot, and of course more on a psychological level, undermining confidence so that the person simply feels incapable alone. That of course leads to a situation in which it's harder to leave. And this is the aim of the perpetrator all along. The aim of the perpetrator is to get a person in a relationship as soon as possible and then keep her there. Threats and intimidation, control is maintained through fear, but it's very often not so explicit. It can often be very subtle. Threatening suicide is something that we see in perpetrators, like, I cannot live without you in a literal sense. So if you leave, you are responsible for whatever I may do. But also, and there is also technology plays a part in that, we see threats to share private information. For instance, revenge porn is something that we often see as part of this pattern. And it can be very implicit, like body language, tone, or reference to past behavior, or even reference to things that we see in the news. Like, for instance, femicide, which is fortunately still a rare occurrence in the Netherlands compared to the number of people who experience this pattern of abuse, is often used by perpetrators to say, you know, this could happen to you. And this can also be like, did you read about this woman in the newspaper? Wow, really sad. This in itself is not a threat. You cannot go to the police and report it. But if you are in a situation where you are being manipulated by a partner, this can feel as a very clear and real threat. The role of physical violence in coercive control is a complicated one, because physical violence is not necessarily an element of coercive control. Many of the very severe cases that I have dealt with as an attorney didn't include any physical violence. So all the abuse was psychological and emotional. And it led to my client being extremely afraid, extremely damaged by what happened in a relationship. But if you would ask her, did he ever hit you? The answer would be no. Which also means, okay, where do you start with this story? Do you go to the police? Okay, they're going to ask you, did he shove you? Did he kick you? Did he hit you? And you have to say no to every question. What can you actually tell as a story? What we see with coercive control is that physical violence is just one of the many tools in the perpetrator's toolbox. I've just discussed a lot of them. There are many more. And what we see is that a perpetrator will, in most cases, only resort to physical violence if all other tools stop working. And here we also see that physical violence is used instrumentally, aimed to control. If other ways to control fail, then physical violence can come into play. So, different than in other cases of domestic abuse, we see that this again is very instrumental. It's not a situation, oh, I lost control over my emotions. I was so provoked by you, and now unfortunately, I lost control and I hit you. No, it is very deliberate behavior. I have no other way to control you. I will, for instance, choke you. We see a lot of what we call non-fatal strangulation in cases like this. Grabbing a person by the throat, cutting off air supply is a very effective way to intimidate. Basically, you only have to do that once properly in order to terrorize somebody into obedience for a really long time. And we also see that physical violence very often occurs for the first time when the victim is pregnant. That's a really sad statistic, but unfortunately it's true. And there we see that the violence is also aimed against the pregnancy. So we would, for instance, see kicking in the belly of a pregnant woman or stomping in the belly of a pregnant woman. And this is a way for a perpetrator to say, look what I can do to your child. You better obey, you better do what I want, because otherwise I will harm your child. Again, very instrumental, very nasty, and also extremely effective, unfortunately. Very often women stay in relationships like this for prolonged periods of time after one such incident of physical violence, simply because they are afraid to leave. What we also see is that relationships that have no physical violence at all can escalate dramatically into physical violence when the victim actually gives signs that she's going to leave. And this is often the case in situations that lead to femicide, where we have relationships that did not include physical violence at all, but like zero, and then escalate into murder within a few weeks' time. This is also what makes it really difficult. You can often, in hindsight, it's often easy. You think, okay, yeah, this pattern led to this outcome. But because there is no physical violence before, this is very often missed as a warning sign. And sexual violence in coercive control is very rampant. It's very often a substantial part of the pattern of abuse. But again, this is often not achieved by physical violence. We see coerced and manipulating partners who basically get their partners to comply to sexual acts that they don't actually consent to. But because this is part of a pattern of coercion and manipulation, victims often don't perceive this as rape, which of course technically it is. So very often when you speak with victims after they have gotten themselves free from a certain relationship, then they will start looking at what actually happened and recognize that they did a lot of things against their will. But at the time, they didn't even feel that they could show that they didn't consent. Evan Stark is the great theoretician of coercive control, an American sociologist who first coined the term, and he calls this rape as routine. It's so part of the pattern of abuse that it's not even something that is distinct from other forms of violence. So what are the effects of this accumulative on a victim? We see a real loss of identity. I've spoken with women who came out of relationships like this, who said, I am nothing like I was before. I don't even recognize myself today. How did I become the way I am now? But this is, of course, a result of a process that often took years, in which slowly their confidence and their feeling of autonomy was greatly reduced. Obviously, we see anxiety and depression. That's a normal consequence, you would say, but also social withdrawal. A lot of victims are extremely ashamed of what happened to them, especially because these are often highly educated women who never thought that this could happen to them, whom society doesn't expect this to happen to. That's also part of that, which makes it, and it's a hard narrative to tell. It's in many ways, not to in any way diminish the experience of women who experience what we call classical domestic violence, but it's an easier narrative to tell. Like, my partner has an alcohol problem, and when he's drunk, he becomes violent, and then he hits me, and this is terrible, and I need to get out of this situation, is in a way an easier narrative to tell than saying, well, I thought I fell in love with this really great guy, and if you look at him from the outside, you would never know how he is in real life. But in a way, I don't really understand how it happened, but now he decides every little detail in my life. But if you ask me, did he hit me? No, the answer is no. This is a really hard narrative to share with people, especially if they have never heard of this pattern before. So what do we know about perpetrators of coercive control? Again, like victims part of any demographic, we also see this in perpetrators. All ages, all backgrounds, all socioeconomic groups. As I said in the beginning, very often male, not always, but predominantly. And many appear socially normal or even charming. I've seen these men in courtrooms on hundreds of occasions, and very often they do a great job in pretending to be totally normal, highly functioning adults, which unfortunately is often what they are. What distinguishes them is their behavior, not their identity or even a mental illness or a mental problem. And what we see as an underlying belief, what feeds this behavior, is entitlement. That's something that Evan Stark really explained in his fundamental work on this issue, is there is a sense of entitlement to regulate another person's life. I deserve this. I have a right to tell her what to do. I have a right to expect obedient behavior from her. Ownership thinking, she belongs to me. We are in a relationship, thus you are mine forever. And there is a clear sense of justification also, like, okay, maybe I don't always act nice, especially if physical violence comes into play eventually, but she made me do it. If only she did what I expected of her, what I rightfully expected of her, then none of this would have had to happen. And this is a thought process. It's cognitive patterns that we see in all these cases alike. And this is not an illness as such. There are perpetrators who have, for instance, personality disorders, who have narcissism or borderline personality disorders, but this is actually a minority. The majority of perpetrators of this form of abuse are totally normal individuals. And this is to be explained because coercive control, of course, is part of a broad spectrum of violence against women. It doesn't stand on its own. It's not it's not in a vacuum. It builds on attitudes and beliefs that we have widely in our society, microaggressions that we see widely, which can lead to normalizing this behavior. And this sense of entitlement that these perpetrators have is something that feeds from there. And again, there are, of course, many men who don't have this at all, who don't feel this entitlement, who don't have these cognitive patterns, and they would never show this type of behavior. But there are, unfortunately, a lot of people who do, and in cases that are more extreme, this leads to this form of abuse. And what is complicated now, what I really see in my work, is that manosphere really that the influence of the manosphere really normalizes what we recognize as coercive behavior. The Andrew Tates of this world, but of course there are many more, actually teach young men that this is how you should treat your partner, that this is how a man should behave towards a wife, which greatly complicates, of course, the fight against this form of abuse. And this is also something that, of course, women pick up on as well. The phenomenon of the thread wife, the traditional wife, are women who feel that it's rightfully so, that they are coerced and controlled by their male partners. So again, this is a gender problem that is a shared problem by both men and women, that we should also try to solve together if we want to end this form of abuse. And like I said before, technology makes coercion and control very easy. I'm really shocked. I've been working in this field for 20 years, and it's so much easier to stalk and to control than it was 2 decades ago. In that sense, we always have to be aware what technology can do also in the hands of a perpetrator. I often see with professionals that they are very naive again about this. Coercive control doesn't stop with the end of the relationship. A perpetrator wants to maintain control. This makes sense, right? When the perpetrator wants to get the victim into the relation, wants to keep the victim in the relation. And there's no like magic switch that, you decided to leave, now you are no longer mine, apparently. No, the perpetrator wants to maintain control. So we often see that coercion doesn't end but changes form. Stalking, for instance, is very, very common after the end of a relationship that is marred by this form of abuse. But we also see a lot of threats. And in cases where people have children together, we see manipulation of children, we see legal abuse. The family law system is often very helpful tool in the hands of a perpetrator, but that's for another lecture. And in extreme cases, we see femicide. This is a sheet with some figures from the Central Bureau of Statistics about murder in the Netherlands. This is not only femicide, this is both male and female victims. So the one above are women and the one below are men. And what we see that women are predominantly killed by their ex-partner or partner, or by their parents or other relatives. That's the light blue, the dark blue, and the green. So that's the majority of cases. The perpetrator of the murder is somebody very close to the victim. And with men, the pattern is much more diffuse. So we have a very small percentage of ex-partner. That's only 4% of the cases. But we also have criminals who kill each other, basically. Acquaintances, kennis, it's a large section. And basically other or unknown. Of course, we see that men have a higher risk, for instance, to be murdered in public spaces, for instance, when they go out. So that's a typical risk that men have that women don't have. The risk that women have is predominantly in their own intimate sphere. And in the age group of 20 to 60, that's basically a large age group, like adult life, you would say, 70% of the murders of women occur by partner or ex-partner. That's a really, really high number. So basically the highest risk you run in your own intimate sphere. Jane Monckton Smith is an English criminologist who used to work for the police. And she did a lot of research in partner killings, and she came up with what we call the homicide timeline. I will go through that with you really quickly with a view of the time, because it's interesting how she connects coercive behavior with partner killing. And what's important in the first stage is that's not even a stage in the relationship, it's before. It's what happened before the relationship starts. We see very often that the perpetrator already has a history of domestic abuse or stalking or controlling behavior. And it's important to note this because that shows that this is behavior that comes into the relationship with the perpetrator. It's not a dynamic between partners that leads to coercive control. It's the perpetrator who brings this behavior with him. And if you know, for instance, that a guy was controlling in another relationship or was stalking, or you hear stories of that, that is often an indicator of trouble. Past behavior is a very good predictor of future behavior when it comes to coercive control. We see the love bombing. She noticed this in her review of 400 murder cases in the UK, that very often the relationship progresses very quickly with intense declarations of love and early signs of possessiveness and jealousy. That's what we discussed before. The relationship becomes dominated by coercive control with all the patterns that we discussed: isolation, monitoring and control, and a loss of autonomy. And then we see that a trigger occurs, a perceived threat to the perpetrator's control. For instance, an indication that the victim may want to leave or end the relationship. And this becomes a critical escalation point. And what happens then is that the situation escalates. We see an increase in threats, surveillance, intimidation, stalking often occurs, and then the victim can back down. This often happens. So submits again to the control, and then the escalation goes down, or it doesn't, and then it can become very dangerous. Because the sixth phase is a change in thinking, in perception on the side of the perpetrator. And this is something that you can really only see in hindsight if you review a case, because that's not external. But the perpetrator begins to see murder as a solution to his problem and violence as justified or even inevitable. And you see an internal narrative shifts to, I have no choice, I should do this, I have the right to do this. And then we see planning. These killings are very, very often premeditated and prepared. We see acquiring of weapons, tracking routines, making sure that you know where a victim lives, making arrangements financially for later or creating an alibi. And a homicide or the attempt to homicide is very often extremely violent, also by perpetrators who were not physically violent before. And we see very often in around 60% of the cases that the murder is followed by the suicide of the perpetrator. Or if that is not the case, we see that the perpetrator will create a narrative that he lost control, where very often you can see, if you look at the case closely, that the build-up to the violence was actually very clear. Insights from the homicide timeline, that femicide is in many cases a predictable escalation, but in most cases they stay in a loop between stages 3 to 5 and don't escalate into murder. We have to keep in mind that femicide, though very tragic every case, is still rare compared to the prevalence of coercive control as a much larger group. But of course there is still always the risk, you need to be aware of it, that separation increases risk. And it's important to keep that in mind and take into account when you are leaving a coercive relationship or when you're advising a victim to leave a coercive relationship. The defining feature of coercive control isn't any singular behavior. It's not an incident. It's not one occurrence. It's a cumulative impact. And it leads to a loss of freedom, agency, and identity. And coercive control may look like love. It very often does in the beginning, and the perpetrator will try to frame it as love, but it has in fact nothing to do with love. It has to do with control. But why is this so hard to identify? The pattern evolves slowly and subtly. Many behaviors are socially normalized. We tend to see jealousy, for instance, as a sign of care, as a sign of love even. And each act alone may seem insignificant, but we need to look at the whole situation. We need to look at the film, not the photo. Emotional attachment from the victim to the perpetrator complicates perception, obviously. It's very hard to recognize this behavior when you are, in fact, actually as a victim, truly in love with the perpetrator or truly love the perpetrator. And we see that the person experiencing coercive control will internalize blame. They will blame themselves for the situation. Often the perpetrator is very good in manipulating them into thinking that. So they will not recognize the responsibility where it needs to lie. So what is a key question when you are in a relationship? Well, a useful thing to ask is, am I becoming more free? Can I be more myself in this relationship or less? If the trajectory you are in a relationship is toward restriction, if you feel that you can do less than you could earlier, if you feel that you have to negotiate more, if you are more afraid, if you experience diminished autonomy, then that's a really strong indicator of coercive control. And this is something to keep in mind for yourself, but also when you are looking at relationship from friends. Very often, of course, the beginning of a relationship, people are completely infatuated by each other, also if it's not coercive control. But this is something that should evolve over time into a bit more of a normalcy. If a person completely becomes invisible in your social circles as a result of a relationship, it's not a bad idea to ask, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? How do you feel about this relationship? Is there anything that makes you uncomfortable? Because it's very often the people around the person who indicate the red flags earlier than a victim itself can identify them. So that's something to keep in mind. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions.